Well, thank you very much for your kind welcome. It really is a great privilege to be here this evening. Thank you so much for your invitation. I want to say two things by way of introduction. First, can I just apologise for my accent? I sound appallingly English. I assure you, brothers and sisters, I'm not English. I lived in Glasgow till I was 8. My parents are from Glasgow. We moved to Northern Ireland when I was 8, and instantly I became Northern Irish overnight, instantly. And then when I was 12, we moved to Manchester, and I became all Manchester, you know. And then, and I've just lived in England too long, and I did think it would come back a bit since coming back to Scotland, but unfortunately, it hasn't. So you've just got me the way it is. I'm sorry about that. The second thing is to say, I understand that my former colleague and good friend, Bob File, collapsed the first time he came to preach here. I feel just fine at the moment. I'm not intending to. I'm trying to avoid doing that. So I hope that will be all right this evening. Mark's Gospel. You'll find a piece of paper. I hope you should have been given on your way in. It's appallingly difficult to know what to say about such a big book in a couple of half-hour sessions on a Saturday evening. I don't know about you, but Saturday evening is not my peak mental time during the week, and I imagine it's not yours either. So let me tell you what I'm going to do. In this first session, I want to give you a kind of dip your toe in the book, what's going on, and sort of how it works. And in the second session this evening, we're going to look in particular about how Mark's Gospel uses the Old Testament, or rather, to put it slightly differently, how the Old Testament story drives Mark's Gospel. I hope you're ready to do a bit of work. I'm not going to speak all evening. I hope you're ready to do a bit of work. From time to time, I'll give you little things to do with your next door neighbour, things to talk about, and I hope that will prove useful. Let me introduce it by just getting you to do something. I'd like you to turn to your next door neighbour for a moment, and I want you to think, if you were to ask an average person in church tomorrow morning, tell me what you know about Jesus, what do you think they would say? Go, talk about that. I'll give you a minute. What do you think they would say? All right, here's a guess. I imagine you said things like, I think people would say, Jesus is God come in the flesh, very powerful, great teacher, came to die for sins, died and rose, ascended to heaven, sent the Spirit, coming again to judge at the end of the age. I imagine, here's a guess, I imagine once you get beyond that, people might have problems filling in a lot more detail. We know lots of stories about Jesus, if we've been around Christian circles for a while, but often it kind of gets boiled down into those basic headings. We live at the end of a 150 or so year period in Western Christianity, where there has been an unparalleled assault on the person of Jesus. Unparalleled, really, since the early centuries. And one of the consequences of that has been that people have significantly lost confidence in the Gospels. Is the Jesus in the Gospels the Jesus of history? And one of the impacts of that has been that in church, the Gospels are often taught kind of piecemeal. A story about Jesus from one gospel and a story about Jesus from another gospel, or going all the way through a gospel, but with no really clear idea of how the story unfolds. I wonder if you ask somebody tomorrow, could you tell me the story of John's gospel? That might be a different level of question, don't you think? Or could you tell me what Matthew's particular angles on Jesus are? That might be a more difficult question to answer. The Bible presents Jesus to us, not just in one mishmash of stories, but 4 stories. Not a different Jesus in each one, but different perspectives on the same person, certainly. John's Gospel, for example, if you read it, is not a bit like Matthew or Mark. Quite different agenda in lots of ways. What I want to do is to try and get you a little bit, in this first session, a little bit inside the shape of Mark's Gospel. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Mark's Gospel as a whole book. If you want to take this further, you'll find at the bottom of page 2 a recommendation of a book to read. It's not a hard book to read, but it's a really brilliant introduction to what's going on in the Gospel of Mark. It's called Dig Deeper into the Gospels. It's written by Andrew Satch and Tim Hurns. You would find that a really helpful place if you wanted to take this evening further. I think it's an excellent book, really useful. So let's put our toe through the door of Mark's Gospel and have a look at a few things. Who wrote it? Who wrote it and when? Well, tradition has it that it's written by John Mark, the accomplice of Paul the Apostle, and that probably his information significantly comes from the Apostle Peter. That's historical tradition that has that. You'll notice, of course, that the book doesn't name the author at all. Not a whisper. So tradition is probably right, but we don't have any more information than that. What is significant about Mark is that he's got his own style. And one of the things I want to introduce you first to is the sort of style. How does the book work? Look at chapter 1, would you please? It's a very, I don't know what the word is, punchy sort of book. You'll notice in Mark's Gospel all the way through the word immediately. Immediately he did this. Immediately he did that. Immediately something happened. It's bang, 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 bang. It's full of action. One thing, then another thing, then another thing. Here's another thing that he does. He often uses threesomes. 3 things. So in Mark's Gospel, Jesus prays 3 times, every time at very significant points. There are 3 big teaching blocks in Mark's Gospel. Chapter 4, chapter 7, chapter 13. 3 times in the second half of Mark's Gospel, Jesus predicts his death, his coming death. And we'll also find that things are often grouped into threesomes. And I'll show you some examples of those later on in the book. Just as any human author has a style, so the gospel writers have a style. One of the things that Mark often does is he puts things next door to one another without comment to kind of interact with one another. Let me give you 2 examples to work on. First, turn right to near the end to chapter 15, verses 37 to 39. Now, these are very familiar verses if you've been around church for a while. Chapter 15, verses 37 to 39. This is at the crucifixion. I'm going to read 37 to 39, and I want you to tell me what the big surprise is. I'll give you, again, 30 seconds to talk to your next door neighbour. Let me read it, and then see if you can work out what the big surprise is. 37. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." What's the big surprise? Talk to your next door neighbour. What's most surprising as far as you can see? You're allowed to find more than one. You're allowed to find more than one. Okay, folks, what did you come up with? Now, this is not a trick question. It's not a trick question, and there are many things that are surprising. Let's have some candidates. What did you find surprising? Anyone?
I think it's the positioning of the curtain being torn.
Yes?
Jesus breathed his last, the centurion still at the cross.
Yes?
Suddenly there's the fact of the curtain being torn.
Yes? Good. What's especially surprising about that?
To take the focus away from the cross.
Yes.
And we understand the importance of the curtain being laid.
Yeah.
But just the transference away from the focus of the cross to the temple.
Absolutely. That's very significant, that, isn't it? Notice you cannot see all those events from the same place. Jesus dies on the cross. Suddenly, curtain of the temple torn in two. Suddenly, back to the cross, and the centurion standing there. If you were doing it in a film, there would be an instant scene change. You cannot see those places from the same place. Now, isn't that surprising? Why does he put them together like that? Almost certainly because they are related to one another. And we'll explore that relationship a bit more in the second session this evening. Notice 3 events put very close to one another. I said that Mark does things in threesomes. Here are 3 events, 2 at the cross on either side, and 1 somewhere else, stuck right in the middle. That's absolutely typical of the way he does things. 3 things, often the 2 things on the edge are related to one another, like the bits of bread in a sandwich, they're somewhat related to one another, and the middle one's different, and they work together. That's absolutely typical. Now, we'll look at the significance of that one a little bit later on, because it's very deeply significant. Let me give you another example. I'm going to, I think I'll not read this bit. Go to chapter 11. And verses 11 to 28. And just skim through verses 11 to 28. And here's the question. What things are being placed next to each other? Just as that crucifixion scene has things placed next to each other, the cross, the temple, the centurion, what things are placed next to each other through this section? Have a quick skim through, and then I'll give you a minute or 2 to talk to your neighbour about that. Okay, just talk to your next door neighbour about that. What's he putting next to each other all the way through this section? Talk about that. Okay, folks. Two things. Number one, what do you think? Temple. Yes, good. Temple. There's certainly a movement. Good. What else happens at the Bethany bit? Or good. Fig tree. Do you notice how it goes? Verse 11, temple. Verse 12, fig tree. Verse 15, temple. Verse 20, fig tree. Verse 27, back in the temple again. This is not a sandwich, folks. This is a licorice all sort. Temple, fig tree, temple, fig tree, temple. Multiple layers. What do you think that does? It makes you think there's something, these two things in some way correspond to one another. Something's going on. They're related to one another because it goes backwards and forwards, one to the other, all the way through. Again, that's absolutely typical of the way Mark does things. Now, we'll explore that one in a little bit more detail in part 2. But I just wanted to introduce you to that. Notice that there is, in none of those places, is there any editorial comment. He never says, by the way, folks, I'm creating this licorice all sort, so that he doesn't explain what he's doing, but all the way through the book, he just puts things beside one another like that to kind of comment on one another. Now, you're left as the reader to work out, okay, why is he putting those together like that? What's his purpose in doing that? But it's quite deliberate, I think. And he does it all the way through this book. So if you're reading Mark, that's a thing to watch out for. You move from one thing to another thing and back to the same thing again. Why is he doing that? It's always a good question to ask. Let me introduce you to, so that's a kind of, that's the kind of way he operates. Let me introduce you to the direction of the story. Let me start you at chapter 1, verse 1. It's a very good place to start, right at the beginning. Let's turn to Mark chapter 1, verse 1. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, many people reading this gospel have noticed that those two phrases, the Christ, the Son of God, kind of divide the book up. So if you turn on to chapter 8, please, which is about halfway through, at a very important point, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Verse 29, and Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." There's part 1 of that thing in chapter 1. And if you flip over to where we've been already, to chapter 15 and the centurion, what does the centurion say as Jesus dies on the cross? Truly, this man was the Son of God. There's the second part of that introductory phrase. So it's obvious that in some way that headline phrase kind of splits the book up into two. Now, many people have said, therefore, the first part of the book is about who Jesus is, the Christ, the King, and the second part of the book, given its emphasis on Jesus' coming death, is about what Jesus came to do. So, Mark part 1, who Jesus is. Mark part 2, what Jesus came to do. The trouble with that is that part 1 has got loads in it about what Jesus came to do, and part 2 has got loads in it about who Jesus is. So it doesn't quite divide up as neatly as that. All the same, it's a big landmark, that halfway point. Peter gets it. He gets the identity right. You are the Christ. And he does not understand that Jesus must die. So that's a big issue. Let me look at the direction of this story. We're on 3b now at the bottom of the page. Mark's gospel is a straight line gospel. That is to say, it starts in Galilee, chapters 1 to 8, and then there's a journey to Jerusalem. It's a short phase, the journey phase, chapters 9 and 10, and then there's chapters 11 to 16 in Jerusalem. It's not like John's gospel, where there's lots of toing and froing from Jerusalem. This is not the only, Jesus had other journeys to Jerusalem, but Mark just has a straight line book. Notice that more than a third of the book, chapters 11 to 16, concern the last week of Jesus' activity before his death. In other words, it's a straight line journey, but towards the end it really slows down because we cover a lot of ground in chapters 1 to 10, and we cover only a week in chapter 11 to 16. So it's an unusual book. There are a number of very significant turning points in the story over the page. Here is a kind of timeline with some of the more significant turning points in the story in it. We may have a little bit of time to come back to this towards the end of this session. But notice how significant the things are that happen in this book. After chapter 1, verse 39, all the way through until chapter 11, Jesus avoids crowds and travels around continually from place to place. Chapter 1 and 2 are not like that. But from 139 onwards, we're always traveling and trying to keep quiet. Why is that? Something's happened. In chapter 3, verse 6, the religious leaders are planning to murder Jesus. That's pretty early on in the story. Something big has happened between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 3. What is the big thing that's happened? A big thing has happened. You don't decide to murder somebody without reason. Chapter 3, verse 13. At this point, Jesus chooses 12 to be with him. After this point, nearly all of Jesus' teaching focuses in on those 12 in Mark's Gospel. In chapters 1 and 2, his teaching is public, but not from chapter 3 onwards. Everything is very private. From chapter 4, verse 1, all of Jesus' public teaching is in parables, which are explained privately to his disciples. Now, as we'll explore in a little while, that is a very strange thing to do if you're a great preacher. Public parables, private explanation. Why does he do that? It's a very strange thing to do. Now, we're used to Jesus teaching in parables. It's familiar to us. But it's a big change in the story because he wasn't teaching in parables in chapter 1 and 2. It's only chapter 4 onwards that he's doing that. Chapter 8, verse 39. After this point, Jesus begins to teach the 12 about his coming death. He doesn't teach them about that until this point. Why is that exactly? Chapter 11, verse 11. After this point, nearly everything that happens in this book happens in and around the temple. Why is that? Gets a lot of airtime. Nearly everything happens in the temple. You can see then, just on this brief survey, that this is a book where major developments happen on a regular basis. Big changes are happening. All of these things merit some explanation, don't they? Why do you suddenly change from teaching everybody publicly to teaching in parables publicly, but only giving the explanation to your disciples? That's a very big change. Why does he do that? And so on and so on. It's a very, very exciting book. Big things are happening all the way through. Big changes are happening all the way through. And these raise really big questions. Just turn to Mark chapter 4, verses 1 to 9. I want you to imagine that tomorrow morning, Westwoodhill is absolutely packed to the gunnels. Standing space only, huge crowd. And I want you to imagine the preacher does something like this. Here we go. He began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea, and the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land, and he was teaching them many things in parables. And in his teaching he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and immediately sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And other seeds fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. And he said, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Imagine church is full tomorrow morning, and Craig Dyer, who I know very well, and he won't do this, but imagine he did. Imagine he said, "I'd like to tell you a story this morning. There was a man who developed a leak in his water pipe. He tried to stick some sticking plaster on it, but the sticking plaster became soggy and fell off. Then he tried to wrap sellotape round it, and it worked a little bit better because he wrapped a lot round, but in the end, the water soaked through the sellotape. Eventually, he went to B&Q and bought some duct tape, and that worked brilliantly. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Shuts his Bible, retires, sits down. Sermon over. What's surprising about that, folks? Talk to your next door neighbour. The big surprise? Look at the crowd. Chapter 4, verse 1. Look at the crowd. Look at the opportunity. So big a crowd that you have to get into a boat so they don't squash you to death. And you have to speak from the boat to the beach. So big a crowd. Such a huge opportunity. Imagine this building full of people tomorrow morning, and that's all the sermon you get. Because, folks, that's all they get. Little stories like that. Who gets the explanation? Verse 10. The disciples and anyone who comes to ask when he's on his own in private. Now that is seriously strange, isn't it? You would be very, very unhappy indeed if this building was full of visitors tomorrow morning and Craig Dyer did that. Wouldn't you? If you want to hear more folks, you can come and talk. You'd want more than that, wouldn't you? So why is the greatest preacher that ever lived telling little agricultural stories in public with no explanation at all? There's a big surprise, don't you think? A big surprise. We usually think that parables are illustrations. They are not illustrations. They're invitations. And that's a really weird way of teaching. It's not normal, and indeed, Christians are not encouraged to do that either. When you hear the Apostle Paul urging the Colossians that they would pray for him, what does he pray? Pray that I would declare the message clearly as I ought. Plain proclamation is the order of the day post-Pentecost. So why does Jesus do this? Now, is that not intriguing? Really demands an answer, doesn't it? We may get to the answer after coffee, just to keep you waiting. They had to wait that day. We may get there after coffee. It's a huge surprise, though, isn't it? But we're so used to the idea of Jesus teaching in parables that we think, oh yeah, he taught in parables so that people could understand. And indeed, he does teach so that they can understand. But it's a very strange way of teaching. And notice, he did not do that in chapters 1 and 2. So something's changed. What's changed? That's the question. More of that after coffee. Okay. Let me point you to chapter 1. We'll look at chapter 1 in a bit more detail after coffee as well. Quick glance at chapter 1, verses 1 to 15, the kind of introductory bit of Mark's Gospel. What's the surprise? Anyone? what's there, what's not there. Anyone? No birth, no angels, no stable, no shepherds, none of that stuff. Just bang, Old Testament, and then John the Baptist, all grown up, verse 4. It's really not like Matthew and Luke, is it? Where there's a lot of background and birth. Mark starts, boom, straight in like that. Again, very surprising. And what you'll notice is that the headline introduction is, verse 2, a quotation from the Old Testament. Now, one of the things we'll find after coffee is that the Old Testament is massively important in the way Mark writes his book. And the Old Testament drives this book very, very significantly. In fact, the book of Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 2, is hugely important in the story of Mark's Gospel. And at key points, the book of Isaiah is very significant indeed. So it's there in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. And it's there in 4:12. Interestingly, just flip over to 4:12. Why does Jesus teach in parables? Verse 11. To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything is in parables. Why? So that they may indeed see but not perceive, and indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. Now there's a surprising quotation. That comes from Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah is very important in this book, mentioned in chapter 1, mentioned in chapter 4. We find Isaiah in chapter 7. Major conflict in chapter 7 with the religious leaders. Jesus quotes from Isaiah. We find him in chapter 9, quoting from Isaiah. We find him in chapter 11. We'll look at this one after coffee, quoting from Isaiah. Chapters 12, verses 1 to 8 are lifted from Isaiah chapter 5. You know the parable of the tenants? God planting a vineyard, putting tenants to farm the vineyard. The vineyard the tenants won't let the owner have any fruit from the vineyard. That comes straight from Isaiah 5, just before Isaiah 6, which is quoted in Mark chapter 4. And right on through Isaiah chapter 13 also has a big quotation from Isaiah. So the Old Testament is very important in the background of this book. The book of Isaiah is especially important in the background of this book. And we'll just dip our toes into that after coffee. Now, folks, I've introduced you to loads of ideas and I've asked loads of questions and not given you any answers. We'll try and do some of the answers after coffee. But let me say this. It's very important that we get some handle on the Old Testament story and how it introduces the Gospels. All over the world, many things call themselves Christian. Not all of them are. In all of them, those things that call themselves Christian, Jesus is right at the center of the thing. But you'll notice, if you look around the world, that Jesus can be used to justify nearly anything. Jesus is the political activist, the liberator of the poor. Jesus is the healer of the sick. Jesus is the one who comes to save from sins. Jesus is the good teacher. Jesus is all kinds of things. In all of those settings, Jesus is the answer in people's minds. Jesus is the answer. The issue is, what is the question that Jesus is the answer to? You see, it's easy to wheel out Jesus as the answer, but the big issue is, what's the question that Jesus has come to be the answer to? The Old Testament asks the question, if that's the right way of putting it. The Old Testament asks the question that Jesus is the answer to. And unless you have a bit of Old Testament on board, Jesus can be made to be the answer to almost anything, because there's so much you could say about him. So what we're going to do after coffee is to look a little bit at how the Old Testament asks the question that Jesus in Mark's Gospel is the answer to. What is the problem that Jesus has come to deal with? Now, folks, we live in an age which is increasingly, almost totally illiterate about the Bible. Nothing is more important that we not only talk about Jesus, but try and paint some of the picture of the Old Testament story. If we don't do that, the Jesus we talk about will be kind of free-floating, not really doing anything in particular, or doing almost anything. The Old Testament story sets the scene for the coming of Jesus in ways that are really helpful. And after coffee, we'll try and get into some of how that happens. Folks, I think I'll draw stumps there at that point. And you said about 10-2, so it's about 10-2. Good, all right, thanks.
Just stop for tea and coffee just now. We're back in the seats for